It's the Built in Black America podcast. Today, we're talking with a guy who went from writing policies in the White House to writing about soul food and black culture. He's called the Soul Food Scholar. Hey folks, I'm Larry McGill. Thanks for joining me on the journey today. I'll be talking with Adrian Miller. He's the author of 3 books. That third one is coming out in a matter of weeks. It's called Black Smoke, and it talks about the history and the effects that black people have had on barbecue. We'll be talking about the book, plus why it's important for black people to preserve and tell our own stories. But first, I gotta give you the rundown. Adrian Miller started his career as an attorney and public policy advisor, but now he's a recognized food historian and writer. He worked in the Bill Clinton White House and then went on to work in the Colorado governor's office. In 2013, he released his first book, Soul Food, the story of an American cuisine, one plate at a time. The book garnered him a prestigious James Beard Award. It also paved the way for his second book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of African Americans who fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas. I talked with Adrian Miller just weeks before his latest book hit store shelves. First off, tell me how you got started in your career overall. I know you went to law school and matriculated over to the Bill Clinton White House. Tell me what it was like when you first got to law school and you were looking for something to do.
Yeah, so when I was in law school, I really had 2 dreams. One was that I might become an international human rights lawyer because I majored in international relations at Stanford. I love traveling overseas, and so I thought that might be an interesting career. And then the other one is that I've always been drawn to politics, so I thought at some point that I would be the senator from Colorado, my home state. So I was trying to figure out what would be the best path to either pursue one of those. And this was the early 90s, so given just kind of the race relation problems and other stuff that was happening in the U.S., I thought more and more, maybe my talents are best served by being focused on the U.S. So I put aside the international human rights lawyer stuff, and I thought, okay, eventually I'm going to get into politics. And so I thought my path was go practice law for 10 years, get immersed in a community, do all of the networking and everything, and then run for office. So that was my plan in the early 90s. But the major speed bump I had was I hated the practice of law. This is not to disparage any attorneys you have in your audience, maybe in your family, but it wasn't for me. I got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. So I figured I needed to do something else. So I was going to actually open up a soul food restaurant in Denver. And then I got a call from a law school, Georgetown Law School classmate who said, hey, I'm working in the Clinton White House. I'm working on this thing called the Initiative for One America. We're looking to hire someone. Do you have friends back in D.C. who might be interested? And I said, well, tell me more about it. And when she told me more about it, I did the same thing that Dick Cheney did when George W. Bush asked him to find a vice president. I was the head of the search committee, and my name was the only one put on the list. So that's how I got to the White House.
And this was a historic portion of the Bill Clinton White House. Tell me what it was like to be a part of this. If I'm not mistaken, it was one of the first ones that was based on race relations, correct?
Yes, it was the first freestanding office in the White House to deal with racial, ethnic, and religious reconciliation. And it was an outgrowth of President Clinton's initiative on race, which was a multi-year effort. I think it was maybe 2.5 years that was led by the late, great John Hope Franklin and some other luminaries. And so when they finished that 2-year process of going around the country talking about race and other things, they made a recommendation to the president, and they said, you need to have an ongoing office in the White House to deal with these issues. So that's what became the Initiative for One America. So it was great, man. The main challenge is that we didn't have a lot of money in our budget. So one of the things we decided to do was to bring leaders of different sectors of our society to the White House and have them talk about and develop their own within the sector plans on how to deal with race and diversity issues. So we had faith leaders first. We had hundreds of faith leaders come to the White House. And then the second big meeting was a Fortune 500 corporate leadership, VP level and above. And then we were going to have a media summit, bring together large sectors of the media, because unfortunately in our segregated society, a lot of times people learn about another group through media that they consume. But the president had turned his attention to the Palestinian issue that last summer, so everything got wiped off the calendar. So we never had that meeting.
A lot of people joke and say that Bill Clinton is the nation's first black president, but a lot of people will be looking or listening in to this podcast, and they will have never lived in that era to know what it was like before Barack Obama.
I know.
So just tell me what it was like overall to be in the Bill Clinton White House administration?
The interesting thing was Bill Clinton is very gifted, and just in general. And I don't know if people appreciate that, but very intelligent. He's one of the few people, white politicians, and not just white people in general, who was very comfortable talking about race, and including the very tough issues about race. So it would be fascinating to be on the stage with him, just kind of looking at the crowd as he's talking to them about some very tough racial issues, showing leadership and telling them, hey, this is tough stuff, but this is within your interest. But the frustration was that some of his top lieutenants weren't so on board with race issues as he was, or as comfortable dealing with them. And some of the pushback we got internally and from other people is this was right around the time that Gore was running for president. And there was this caution like, hey, don't talk about race so much because this is going to alienate white voters and things like that. So, that was frustrating. But because of just the sheer force of his personality and because of his interest, President Clinton kept that ball moving. But, in some ways it was muted by others. But it was cool to be in the White House. I tried to soak up as much as I can. But at some point you're doing a job. So you have the feel of doing a job. So, but I just definitely loved my time there.
It's tough to wrap my head around that there's a whole group of people who are voting now who did not live in that time period. So I wanted to make sure that I put some context there with the gravity of the situation that you were in at the time.
Right, because at that time, even myself, I would have said, oh, it's going to be a while before we have a black president. Because I was just thinking about all the black politicians who were on the scene at that moment. I didn't see any of them being able to build the coalition it would take to become president. So this was kind of like, oh, well, this is our best shot for right now. And so let's make the most of it. And again, I can't think of another white politician who was invested in race issues as much as Bill Clinton was prior to that point. And in recent memory, yeah.
So tell me, you're coming from one of these high-level government policy backgrounds. I know you mentioned that before your fallback was going to be, if you didn't continue with law, was that you wanted to open a soul food restaurant. So tell me about the turn from going from White House policymaker to deciding that you want to write this book that I assume has been in the back of your head for a long time.
So actually, it had not been in my head for a long time. So the short answer is unemployment. What happens when you're a political appointee like me, you write your letter of resignation and you present it to the incoming administration. And shockingly, George W. Bush accepted mine.
Really?
So I was unemployed.
You were surprised.
Actually, there was a moment there where I thought I might get a job in the Bush administration to continue the work of the One America initiative. It might have been muted or changed in some ways, but still would have done that work. And so I was intrigued by that, but it just didn't come to pass. So I was still thinking about becoming a U.S. Senator. So I was trying to get back to Colorado, but the job market was really slow. Just got to the point where I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows. And in the depth of my depravity, I said, I should read something. So I went to the local bookstore and I'm browsing the cookbook section because I'd always been interested in cooking. And I come across this book called Southern Food at Home, on the Road in History, written by John Edgerton. And that book, he wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cookery is yet to be written. So I thought that was really interesting. The book was about 14 years old. And so I followed up with him and I just thought, well, somebody had probably done it. And he said, well, people have addressed parts of it, but nobody's done the comprehensive history. And he said, there's always room for another voice, so why not yours? So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, I decided to take that journey. So that's really what started it. Before that, I was interested in cooking, but I never would have thought that I would write a book, maybe be in a restaurant, but that's it. And so that started the journey.
So I assume that there was a lot of fun in curating this book. Clearly, you have to do a little research. Some of it may be on a plate. I'd imagine a lot of it is not, though. Tell me what it was like to chase these stories about food that, some of this is hundreds of years old in the making.
So it was a mix of joy and pain. Part of it is I was right at the right technological moment, because with the internet and the emerging databases, and we have companies that are digitizing sources from hundreds of years ago, you can do research much more quickly. Because I could imagine this first book, if I had done this 25 years ago before the internet, or, before that time, it probably would have taken me a lot longer. And even with the internet, it took me 12 years to do this work. And that's because I had a day job. So I wasn't solely focused on it. But part of it was reading 3,500 oral histories for formerly enslaved people and looking for all references for food. I read about 500 cookbooks. Now, not all of those were authored by African Americans. A lot of them were from others, but I wanted to put our food in context because our food draws heavily on West Africa, but also heavily on Western Europe. So I wanted to see how those different countries' cuisines shaped soul food or informed soul food. Talked to hundreds of people, and then because I care about my research so much, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities. So the joy and pain part of it was really getting into the testimony of enslaved people. Because in high school, you get a sense that slavery was bad, but there's really not a deep dive into it. And then unless you pursue that, you're just not going to get that knowledge unless you endeavor upon learning yourself. And so listening to this slave testimony, man, just to hear it's not just evil, it's just like sadism that was visited upon enslaved Africans and then later enslaved African Americans was just really sobering. I'll just throw in this quick little anecdote. A couple of years ago, there was a real strong chance that I was going to be working with the son of a serial killer to talk about his experiences with his serial killing father. And a lot of my friends cautioned me in a way that they never did when I was writing about soul food. And they just said, hey, you sure you want to go there? I mean, that's kind of dark stuff. And I said, look, after reading the oral histories of enslaved people, I mean, serial killing is not going to bother me. So, anybody who seeks my advice, wants to get in this field, I cautioned him about, getting into these sources because it's just some unbelievable stuff.
And it just dawned on me, we didn't actually say the title of the first book. What is the full title of that first book first?
Oh, yeah. So it's Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time. And the reason I gave the book that title is so let me just back up. So, I get this basically a call to action about writing the comprehensive tribute to African American achievement in cookery. But after doing some research, and at first I thought I was going to struggle just to get enough information for that. But thanks to the internet and stuff, I had a bounty of information. So I stepped back from the grand project to just focus on soul food because I thought that was the most recognizable aspect of African American cuisine. And so the way I decided to tell this story was to create a representative soul food meal and write a chapter about every part of the meal and explain what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, what it means for the culture.
What are some of the foods that we're talking about here? I mean, there's some obvious ones that pop up to you in your head, but just a quick rundown of maybe 4 or 5 foods that are in there.
Okay, yeah, I can just give you the whole meal very quickly. So entrees, fried chicken, fried fish, or chitlins. Now, I know a lot of people don't want to hear about chitlins, but I can't write a book about soul food without chitlins.
Exactly. That already has polarizing opinions on it.
Side dishes, greens, black-eyed peas, candy jams, and mac and cheese. Wrote a chapter about cornbread, chapter about hot sauce, wrote a chapter about red drink because I believe red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink. And then for dessert, I couldn't settle on one, so I wrote about 4: pound cake, peach cobbler, banana pudding, and sweet potato pie.
Yes.
So that's the meal.
Did you find that there were any, I hate to call it concerted attempts, but did you find that there was a whole lot of sort of masking some of these meals as white people or other races would talk about it when it came to black people that were using these? Or
Well, that changes over time. So before the 1960s, all of this stuff was called Southern food, regardless of who made it and where it was made. Southern food or Southern cooking. And predominantly African Americans were attributed to being the most exceptional culinary artists at making this food. So what I talk about in my book is that what happens in the 1960s is you get this conscious divorce, really at the urging of Black power advocates. So that's where the soul concept, which had been floating around in Black culture before the 60s, gains a lot of momentum. And so you got this idea that somehow this cooking as done by Black people is different than Southern cooking. So soul becomes Black and Southern becomes white. And we're still living with that divorce today because one of the most vibrant conversations in at least culinary circles is this idea of culinary justice. And it's about how do you reintegrate African Americans into the Southern food narrative? Because today, when people think about Southern food, I don't think they necessarily think about Black cooks. I think they're thinking about white chefs or white TV personalities who have made a lot of money off being associated with Southern food. Some of them, as we know now, are using Black people's recipes to gain that wealth. So that's a vibrant discussion. But, the thing that surprised me is I did not know how much African Americans really initiated that separation. and how before that time, how integrated all this cooking was. Because I just assumed, given the racial etiquette of our nation, that African American, it was always like a separate thing, but that was not the case. It was really, yeah, we all eat this stuff, but Black people are the best ones at making it. That was kind of the conventional wisdom.
Before you just made those last two statements, I had never thought about that separation like that. That is technically the same thing, and you have it called two separate things based on who's cooking it.
Yeah. And one of the biggest surprise takeaways from my research is that when we're looking at food in the South, it's really more about class and place than race. So for the most part, Black people and white people of the same socioeconomic class are eating the same food. Now they're not eating them together because of the racial etiquette, right? But they are eating the same stuff. When I went on the country talking about these foods and stuff, invariably there was some white person in the audience saying, "Well, we ate the same stuff." And I said, "I know you did." Then the follow-up question was, "Well, okay, so then what's the difference between country food and soul food?" Just as a joke, I would say, "Well, soul food tastes better."
Yeah. There's this place in my hometown, the little Laurinburg, North Carolina, on the North and South Carolina border. And we had probably one of the greatest barbecue restaurants in North Carolina. It recently burned down. And the
Oh,
owner, for years, he had been talking about retiring, and I guess that was his sign. But it always had all those same foods in it, but it was owned by a white guy.
interesting.
And everybody would swear by it on any given Sunday afternoon because they weren't open every day of the week. Every Sunday afternoon, you'd have crowds of Black people, crowds of white people, crowds of there's a Native American group that's around there too. So you would see crowds of Lumbee Native Americans all at the same place, all eating the same food, and all raving about it.
Really? That's
Yes,
interesting.
yes.
What was the name of that place? Do you remember?
It was called General MacArthur's. The
Okay.
logo was because, it's a barbecue restaurant and it's in the South. It's a pig.
Yeah.
But it's a pig that had the aviator shades like General MacArthur used to wear, and he had a military cap, and he had his corncob pipe.
Interesting. Okay, I'm definitely going to research that. Thank you for putting that in my mind.
We could probably do a whole podcast on soul food, but I want to get to at least touch on the second book and then get to your newest book. So the second one focuses on Black people that worked in the White House to feed the presidents behind the scenes. Tell me about that. Tell me the title of that one first so we don't forget it like we did the last one. But then tell me about the book.
Yeah, and before we pivot, I just want to let people know that Soul Food Book won the James Beard Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Reference, which is the highest honor you can get for food writing. So that was a huge blessing. So the next book is called The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of the African Americans who have fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas. Because as I was wrapping up my research, the Obamas were still in the White House. And that really came out of the research that I did for Soul Food, because as I was just canvassing everything I could get, I came across a few stories of African Americans who were presidential cooks. Not enough to anchor a book, but certainly enough to, like, I could have written a long article, I think, about them. And so I just said, well, this is interesting. Nobody's really talked about this group of people. I'm going to just do some more research eventually and just see what I find. And if I find enough, I wanted that to be a book. And based on my research, I uncovered about 150 African Americans who have cooked for our presidents from Washington to the present day. Trump had African Americans in the kitchen. Biden has African Americans in the kitchen. So it was great to just do that collective biography. And I know I was just scratching the surface because records weren't really kept that well. I would say there's probably at least 100 more people that we just don't even know about, because either the people in the White House at the time just didn't write down kitchen staff, or because they were African American or women, and so they were unimportant in terms of being recorded in history.
Now, are we talking about the full range of cook staff, or are we talking about mostly cooks and people that are sous chefs and anything like that? Or do we have any head chefs in there too? What's the gamut of positions that Black people have held since the White House's inception?
Basically, almost every position. So most of the head cooks, when a slaveholder was in the White House, was an enslaved African American. There were a few exceptions. Jefferson had a white French chef, but I'm convinced that he would have had James Hemings, one of Sally Hemings' older brothers, as his executive chef if Hemings had not died of, he drank himself to death a few months before Jefferson was inaugurated. But I'm almost convinced that Jefferson would have offered him that position. But Washington, he hired a white woman first, and then she lasted only 6 months. I guess her food was nasty. So he tapped a guy from Mount Vernon named Hercules. And so Hercules was his main chef during his presidency. We've had a number of Black women who were the head chef. Now you have to understand the term executive chef of the White House kitchen does not exist before 1961.
Right, right.
That was something that Jacqueline Kennedy created because she wanted to elevate kind of White House cooking. But before that, they were called first cook or head cook. And so if you look at the broad sweep of history, the typical worker in the White House kitchen was a Black woman. And since the Kennedy administration, with this pivot towards emphasizing classical European cuisine, that's when we start to see the influence of Black cooks wane, because as they retire or move on to other positions, white, classically trained European white chefs were hired, usually men. And so it's only recently that we've started to get more back to kind of American cooking. And that's really a nod to Hillary Clinton. She's really the one that kind of changes the trajectory of White House cooking. She doesn't play that up that much, but it was really under her tutelage that we have the current form today where American ingredients and flavors are celebrated. Even when a foreign dignitary is visiting, what they'll do is they'll use American ingredients, but then they'll try to get a flavor profile that's a nod to the flavors of the visiting dignitary.
Interesting. I never knew that about the position of the executive chef. So before 1961, was it still something that was at least celebrated, or it was still just kind of, oh, that's just the head cook, she's part of the White House staff?
Yeah, it wasn't that celebrated because cooking was servants' work. From time to time, you would have chefs who were celebrated, but for the most part, it was menial work. It's always been relatively low pay compared to what people could get in the private sector. But from time to time, there would be headlines about a chef. It was not something that you would see on any regular basis. So it was kind of just, they're part of the team. They work here. And a lot of times the president had to pay for the cook out of their own pocket because it wasn't something that Congress covered. And so that's why we have a lot of African Americans, because that was one of the few jobs that African Americans could have without white backlash. And so the path to the White House kitchen for a lot of cooks was just they happened to be the cook for that person in private life. And so when they become president, they just tap their cook because, they were used to their cooking and it was a way to save money. You didn't have to pay for somebody on the open market, right? So that's how a lot of people became the White House cook. And also, if they were enslaved, they had no say in the matter.
That's interesting. I'd gotten excited about soul food because, there's a picture of collard greens on the front, and I'm from North Carolina. I like collard greens. But this one sounds like it's a deep dive into this as well. So not that I was not intending on getting the second one, but I'll be getting the second one too.
Yeah, I think you'll dig it.
So now let's jump ahead to the third book, Black Smoke. It's called Black Smoke, not because you have smoke for all the people on the internet, but because it's about barbecue.
That's right. Yeah. So I got the name for that title, the idea for that title, at least. I was watching the Pope being christened, right? And the signal that they've selected is white smoke. And so when they said that on the news as I was watching, I was like, black smoke. And so I just held that, I held that one in my pocket for a few years until I came to this book. So Black Smoke, it's called Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue. And this book is part celebration, part restoration. So the celebration part is to celebrate African American barbecue culture and all of its permutations, its beautiful permutations, which is cool. I mean, I just love I love my people and the way what we do with culture and food. So yeah, to celebrate that. But then the main part is restoration. And this is what I mean. If you look at food media today, you wouldn't even know that Black people barbecue. Most of the people presented as barbecue experts are white dudes. There's certain types of white dudes, right? You've got the Bubba type, the dude on Dukes of Hazzard, Duck Dynasty, Moonshiners, they all show up. Even though there's a lot of Black people in rural America, they never get a show. It's just always these, So you got that type. You've got the competition circuit type. You've got the hipster, the dudes with interesting facial hair, glasses, tattoos. And you got the fine dining chef. And fine dining chefs are in barbecue way more than they ever were, say, like 25, 30 years ago. Because barbecue would have been seen as something, oh, that's not something for a professional chef. That's just something you do on your own time with fam. And so because of that, just African Americans are just not represented. And this book is interesting because as I looked at the history, what I found is that for 2 centuries, African Americans were the go-to barbecue cooks. Now, something that people may not expect to hear is that I argue that barbecue is Native American in origin. And basically, Europeans grafted their quick grilling techniques on the long kind of smoking traditions of Native Americans, and then enslaved Africans are later brought into the mix. And that kind of dynamic process leads to barbecue as we understand it today. And so the reason why African Americans become barbecue's go-to cooks is because it was very labor intensive. It was just really hard work. And so, for most of our history in this country, if you have hard work that needs to be done, you make black people do it and don't compensate them. And so, right, with that expertise, then and after the Civil War and slavery has ended, African Americans are barbecue's primary ambassadors. So they're the ones, that you have people all across the country saying they want to do some event and they want to have authentic Southern barbecue. And so they put African Americans on trains and stagecoaches and boats and bring them out to places to perform that barbecue. And it's a spectacle. There's always accounts of people just standing there in awe watching this process unfold, because old school barbecue was this. You had to find an open area, you dug a trench, and then you had to chop some wood, burn it down. You fill that trench with coals. You slaughter the number of animals that you want. You dress them, and then you stick poles in them, and you're cooking whole animal carcasses over this fire that's in the trench. And somebody's got to keep flipping it so it doesn't burn, and somebody's got to sauce it and all of that stuff. And this is over several hours. And in a lot of cases, these barbecues were huge. And I argue that barbecue emerged as the party food of that time because it was scalable. Depending on how many people you wanted to feed, you just calculated how many animals you had to have, and then how long of a trench you needed to have in order to cook those animals. And then you just made sure you had enough African Americans to do all that work.
When you look at modern day barbecue restaurants that are owned by black people, do you find that there is a difference in the image between those and ones that are owned by white people?
It depends on where you are. So I would say that in the South, I don't know if there's that much discernible difference. But I will say this. Overall, the African American joints tend to be, kind of run down looking, which speaks to the lack of access of capital, the disparity for African American entrepreneurs. So they're usually getting a building that has a poor physical plant, has some deterioration, and they don't have the funds for the upkeep. And some people would say that's part of the charm, right? Some say, oh, well, it's not a legit place unless it looks run down. But in terms of kind of the feel, the religious vibe inside, with a lot of old school places, I would say that's definitely, in harmony. Not that much difference. I think with the later generation of barbecue joints, I would say probably the white run joints tend to be fancier in their look, kind of more kitschy, and other things like that. So I think the real differences show up on the menu items. For a long time, black run barbecue joints were really pork based and ribs. So ribs used to be something that you only really got at black joints.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but that's changed now because as barbecue has become more standardized, more people white run restaurants too will have ribs. But back in the day, the signature was really ribs and also a really spicy sauce. And again, that's changed because our palate is warming. So a lot more white people are consuming spicy foods. So it kind of depends on where you are and kind of where you focus your attention. I will say this, there are some trends though that you find in black run barbecue joints. The more often an emphasis on sauce. There's a conventional wisdom that barbecue should be unsauced, and I think black people are like, says who? Because I don't know about you, man, but I've been at joints where you get your barbecue and it's an ocean of sauce and you have some islands of meat poking through, right?
Right.
Another big trend is turkey. I'm seeing turkey replace pork in a lot of iterations. So in North Carolina, man, there's a lot of places now that do chopped turkey. And except for just the lighter color, you would not know that it wasn't pork because it's seasoned exactly the same way. The only difference really is that it's just got a lighter color. And you've got in Memphis, you've got people doing pulled turkey. Chicago area, there are people doing turkey hot links, turkey tips, and things like that.
Yeah, when I live in the Philly suburbs now, when I see a barbecue joint up here, I just I have to question whether it's whether it's up to my standard.
Yeah, I feel you.
There was one thing though that you said that was interesting. You said that in earlier times, ribs were really something that you could only find in black restaurants. Is that because, and my dad used to tell these stories, that a lot of the foods that are cuisine today, particularly in black restaurants, they were once the part that was just rejected. Black people only got that because it was the part of the pig that you didn't want. Chitlins being, one of those few.
Yeah.
But is that the same case for ribs too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course you see recipes for ribs here and there, but it wasn't a popular item really. And so there are stories about black entrepreneurs arriving in a place where ribs were not a desired part. And so they would go to the stockyards after they closed, and they would just go through the trash and get slabs of ribs that had been discarded, right? And then wash them off and take them up and cook them.
Wow.
That's the story of rib tips. With over time, as ribs became more popular, a lot of people that created the St. Louis cut, which is essentially to create, ribs are ovular in appearance, right? So the St. Louis cut is to give it a more uniform kind of rectangular look. And so they're cutting off the tip and other stuff. And so, a whole tradition in Chicago was built off another dude just taking those tips and cooking those up and offering them as an item. So
Wow.
that created a regional style on the south side of Chicago. So yeah, definitely a story about rejected parts. And in my experience, black barbecue tends to be less butchered. Our ribs are going to have more fat, more meat, and that rib tip attached in a black joint. I can't think of a black joint that sells baby back ribs. If you know of one, tell me, but I don't know of one.
Wow. See, that's a revelation right there. You already dropping stuff that I know I need to go out and get that book. So real quickly, because I want to turn to the whole thing about telling the story of even just baby back ribs brings up something else that I know I was talking to you about before. But really quick, tell me when Black Smoke drops and when and where people can get that.
Black Smoke drops April 27th, and it is available. You can go or you can pre-order it from me on my website, soulfoodscholar.com. You could go to my publisher's website, University of North Carolina Press, and then it's also available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So most independent bookstores and bookstores will have it.
And which one benefits you the most?
Oh yeah, if you order directly from me, it does. And then I'm happy to autograph it too. So and I'm happy to say I couldn't have done it without you if you want that kind of autograph.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So we've talked about different stories throughout this conversation today. The story of soul food, the stories behind black people in the working as cooks in the White House, and the story of barbecue, and particularly my favorite, the story about ribs. So when I think about all those things and think about your collection of books now, it leads me to wonder or to think about the importance of black people making sure that they take a bigger part in preserving and telling these stories. How important is that, especially in the 21st century now?
I think it's hugely important to keep telling these stories because really, if you think about it, I shouldn't have been able to write my books because the boon in my research has been looking at old newspapers. And so the consistent theme in my work is that I'm really just kind of repackaging things that were in newspapers 100 years ago. So if we had just kept telling those stories, it would not be a hidden history or something that needs to be revived. And so I think if we can just be better about telling these stories, it would be great. And one thing I often tell folks is that if you look at Black culture, almost every aspect of our culture has gone global except our food. The way we dress, talk, wear clothing, entertain, play sports. And the reason why I think our food hasn't gone global is because we just don't have enough cheerleaders who keep talking about our food and connecting it to our culture. There's certainly aspects of soul food that have gone global, like fried chicken and certain things, but I don't think it's connected to Black culture. I think when people think about fried chicken globally, they're thinking about KFC.
Right, right. As I was looking through the notes on soul food in particular, just off the top of my head, I could think about stories that my dad told about chitlins, stories that my mom told about pound cake, the way that my grandmother talked about making collard greens. It seems like everybody has a story about these, but they're not always getting shared. And I don't know if that's just a function of black families not always being able to stay together here in the 21st century, or if people think that there's some kind of shame in it or what. But, like I said, I could immediately, just for most of those things that you rattled off in that meal, I could think of an immediate story from one of my parents or one of my relatives.
Same aspect is something we should take a closer look at because my argument is that there's been two steady drumbeats of criticism against soul food. One is that it's slave food that's not worthy of celebration, which I think slavery is part of the story, but it's not the entire story. If you look at soul food, it's really complex. It's bringing together the culinary ingredients, traditions of 3 different places in the world. There's a mix of high and low. So, it's just a much more complicated story. And so because it's slave food, it's like, hey, you need to decolonize your plate, your cuisine. So why are you eating the stuff that white people didn't want? And what you find is that that's not the case entirely with soul food. And then the other one is that this food is inherently unhealthy, that it needs a warning label. But again, if you listen to what nutritionists are telling us to eat, more dark leafy greens, more sweet potatoes, okra is a superfood, hibiscus, all of these things are part of our culinary heritage. So I think it's a matter of just people understanding the context for soul food.
So, for anybody that is looking to delve deeper, where do you think people should start if they're trying to expand their knowledge of where this stuff comes from?
Yeah, so the authors I would encourage people to read would be Jessica B. Harris. She's really the kind of the pioneer of this field of of connecting the food in the Americas, at least African heritage food in the Americas to West Africa. And she's written a number of cookbooks and a few books on the subject. Tony Tipton Martin has written some great books about Black cooks, The Jemima Code, her book Jubilee. Both of those won James Beard Awards. There's another guy named Michael Twitty who's doing a lot of work on antebellum foodways among African heritage people. That's kind of the short list of 3 people I would recommend. There's another guy named Frederick Douglass Opie. He's done some writing on this subject. So those are the ones I think about.
Excellent. And what about any good soul food restaurant joints that you could think of off the top of your head?
Yeah, the ones that keep just coming to mind are Bully's Soul Food in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, this is the kind of place where off the main dining room, there's a table, and periodically somebody comes out and strips greens and peels sweet potatoes.
Oh, wow.
Right there while you're eating. Yeah. So I love that place. You know, I don't know if it's still open, but I love Deborah's Kitchen in Philly. I thought that was really tasty.
Okay.
And again, I don't know if that's still open. You know, the other places I think about are the United House of Prayer for All People churches.
Yep.
That usually have a soul food buffet. And, you know, you got these church mothers just throwing it down. And it's usually inexpensive and just on point.
And in every city.
Yep. Yep. And so those are the places that come to mind right now. Unfortunately, a lot of the other memorable places for me have closed. And some of them closed even pre-pandemic, but the pandemic has really run its course on a lot of places.
I know there was a house of prayer right across the street from the university I first went to, North Carolina A&T State University. And there was a house of prayer right across the street, and you could see a line of students.
Okay.
They'd be walking across the street all the time going to get those plates on Friday afternoon.
Yeah,
I can still see it in my head now.
So I scored some points. Huh,
yeah, you should have hit. You probably hit on that one pretty good. Adrian, I think we had a wonderful conversation. I thank you for taking some time out of your day to talk with me about this. Again, your 3 books. I know Black Smoke is available on pre-sale right now on Amazon.com, but they can get it directly from you. Your website is adrianemiller.com.
Yeah, I just tell people soulfoodscholar.com because that's my presence across social media. So that's the easiest one to remember because usually people forget the middle initial. So I just say soulfoodscholar.com. But that's how you find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining me on the Built in Black America podcast. And I certainly hope it's not the last time. Maybe after Black Smoke drops, we can have you on again.
All right, that sounds good. Good to be with you.
Hey, I want to thank Adrian Miller for coming on the Built in Black America podcast. You can find his latest book, Black Smoke, at his website. It's soulfoodscholar.com. I'll have links to that and his social media over on builtinblackамerica.com. Now, if you've made it this far, clearly you're enjoying the Built in Black America podcast, so why not subscribe? We're on all the major platforms, and I'm dropping new content every week. You can also check us out on social media. On Instagram, the handle is Built in Black America, and on Twitter, it's Black America Pod. I'm Larry McGill. Thanks for joining me on the journey with the Built in Black America podcast.